The evening of April 22nd, 1947, arrived in Manhattan with the particular quality of spring that made people walk slower and notice details they normally overlooked. The Lenox Lounge on Malcolm X Boulevard had been operating for 3 years, occupying a corner location that caught evening light through large windows facing two streets. The establishment had been opened by a consortium of white businessmen who recognized Harlem's growing commercial potential and who sought to create a venue that would attract both uptown residents and downtown visitors seeking authentic jazz performances. Bumpy Johnson approached the entrance at 7:40 in the evening, accompanied by three associates who operated various businesses in Harlem's underground economy. Johnson was 42 years old and dressed in a suit of dark blue wool that had been tailored to fit properly, a white shirt with modest collar, and shoes that reflected the care with which he maintained his appearance. His companions were similarly dressed, presenting the image of successful businessmen rather than street operators. The group had been invited to the lounge by a musician who was performing that evening and who had suggested they attend the early show. The musician, a trumpet player named Wesley, who had known Johnson since both were teenagers in South Carolina, had described the lounge as a new establishment that was attracting significant attention and building a reputation for quality performances. As Johnson and his associates reached the entrance, a man stepped forward from the doorway. He was approximately 30 years old, heavy-set, wearing a dark suit that marked him as security or management. His positioning was deliberate, blocking the entrance without appearing overtly confrontational. The man's voice carried the flat accent of someone raised in the outer boroughs. His words were delivered with the mechanical quality of a statement that had been repeated many times. "Private party tonight. We're not accepting walk-ins." Johnson had made reservations through Wesley, and he mentioned this fact calmly, providing the name under which the reservation had been made. The doorman's expression did not change. He glanced at a clipboard he carried, made a show of examining it, then shook his head. "Don't see that name here. Like I said, private party." One of Johnson's associates, a man named Robert, who operated a numbers bank in central Harlem, moved forward slightly. His voice carried irritation. "We can see people going in. Doesn't look like a private party." The doorman's posture shifted subtly, becoming more rigid. "Those are invited guests. You're not on the list." As this exchange occurred, two white couples approached the entrance from the opposite direction. They moved past Johnson's group without slowing, and the doorman stepped aside immediately, greeting them with professional courtesy and holding the door as they entered. The contrast was deliberate and unmistakable. Robert began to speak again, his tone hardening, but Johnson's hand on his shoulder stopped the words. Johnson's expression had not changed throughout the exchange. His face showed neither anger nor surprise, only the assessment of someone observing a situation and cataloging the information it provided. "Oh, we understand," Johnson said to the doorman. His voice was neutral, containing neither challenge nor submission. He turned and walked away from the entrance, moving south along the sidewalk at the same measured pace he had used approaching. His associates followed after brief hesitation, their reluctance visible, but their discipline sufficient to override immediate reaction. They walked 3 blocks before anyone spoke. Robert's voice was tight with suppressed anger. "That was about color. That wasn't about reservations or private parties. Wesley made those reservations himself. Johnson nodded once. Yes. So what are we going to do about it? Think, Johnson replied. They continued walking until they reached a diner on 125th Street where they could sit and order coffee. At the diner was a 24-hour establishment that catered to night workers, cab drivers, and people whose business kept them moving through hours when most of the city slept. The booth they occupied was in the back corner, offering privacy from the handful of other customers scattered throughout the space. Johnson sat quietly for several minutes, drinking coffee and thinking through what had occurred. The personal dimension of the insult was irrelevant. He had experienced racial discrimination countless times in his 4 decades of life, in South Carolina, where he was born, in New York, where he had lived since his teens, in every interaction with institutions and individuals who operated from the assumption that black people occupied a subordinate position in American social hierarchy. But this particular incident carried implications beyond personal insult. The Lenox Lounge was located in Harlem, a neighborhood that was approximately 95% black in population. The business it generated would come almost entirely from black customers or from white customers who came to Harlem specifically to experience black culture and black entertainment. Yet the owners had apparently decided to exclude or limit black patronage, maintaining a discriminatory policy in the heart of a black community. This decision revealed a particular form of economic exploitation. White businessmen could open establishments in black neighborhoods, could profit from black culture and black talent, could extract wealth from the community while simultaneously maintaining policies that treated black people as inferior. The pattern was not unique to the Lenox Lounge. It was visible throughout Harlem in clubs, restaurants, and businesses that were owned by people who did not live in the community and who treated it as colonial territory to be exploited rather than as a neighborhood to be served. The pattern persisted because it was profitable. Black neighborhoods offered commercial opportunities, high population density, cultural vitality, entertainment that attracted customers from outside the neighborhood. White business owners could capitalize on these opportunities while maintaining discriminatory practices because black residents had limited power to respond. Individual complaints could be ignored. Individual boycotts were ineffective against establishments that also served white customers. But the police and political system offered no meaningful recourse because those systems were themselves structured around assumptions of white supremacy. But the pattern also created vulnerabilities. Businesses in black neighborhoods depended on multiple forms of cooperation from the community they were located in. They needed employees who would work for them. They needed customers who would patronize them. They needed relationships with local suppliers, service providers, and informal power structures that controlled everything from garbage collection to protection from theft. A business that alienated the entire community would find these necessary forms of cooperation difficult to obtain or maintain. Johnson understood that challenging the Lenox Lounge specifically, and the pattern it represented, generally would require more than personal confrontation. It would require organized collective action that imposed costs sufficient to change the economic calculation that supported discriminatory policies. And it would require building a coalition that could sustain pressure over time, that could coordinate multiple forms of intervention simultaneously, and that could avoid the kind of overt violence that would justify police crackdown and that would alienate potential allies in the broader community. Over the next week, Johnson began constructing the coalition that would be necessary for effective response. The first conversation was with a minister named Thomas, who led a congregation of approximately 800 members on 132nd Street. Thomas was 53 years old, originally from North Carolina, and had been in Harlem since the 1920s. His church was influential in the community, and his personal credibility extended beyond his congregation to include business owners, professionals, and working-class families who respected his judgment and his commitment to community welfare. Johnson met with Thomas in the minister's office, explaining what had occurred at the Lenox Lounge and describing the broader pattern of discrimination that the incident exemplified. Thomas listened carefully, asking occasional questions about specifics and about Johnson's intentions. "What you're describing is accurate," Thomas said when Johnson had finished. "We see this pattern throughout Harlem. White owners who profit from our community while treating us as undesirable. But challenging it requires more than anger. It requires strategy, and it requires broad participation." "That's why I'm here," Johnson replied. "I can organize certain kinds of pressure, but this needs moral authority and community legitimacy. It needs ministers who can speak to congregations about why this matters. It needs the involvement of people who aren't associated with underground economy and who can't be dismissed as criminals pursuing self-interest." Thomas considered this carefully. "I can support this, but I need to know what you're planning. I can't endorse violence or illegal activity." "No violence unless they initiate it," Johnson said. "The strategy is economic pressure, social pressure, and exposure. We make the Lenox Lounge unprofitable through coordinated non-cooperation. We make it socially unacceptable for black people to work there or patronize it. We publicize their discriminatory practices to embarrass the owners and complicate their relationships with city agencies. We maintain this pressure until they either change their policies or close." "That's essentially a boycott," Thomas observed. "Yes, but a boycott supported by multiple forms of pressure and sustained until it achieves concrete results." Thomas agreed to participate with the understanding that the church's involvement would focus on moral argument and community organizing rather than on tactics that could create legal exposure. He would preach about economic justice and community solidarity. He would use church networks to spread information about the Lenox Lounge's discriminatory practices. And he would encourage congregation members to avoid patronizing establishments that discriminated against black customers. This support would provide moral legitimacy to the broader campaign and would reach community members who might not respond to other forms of organizing. The second major ally was a woman named Margaret, who published a community newspaper called the Harlem Advocate. The paper had a circulation of approximately 6,000, reaching politically engaged residents, business owners, and community leaders who shaped local opinion. Margaret was 45 years old, college-educated at a time when that was rare for black women, and had been publishing the paper since 1938. Her editorial voice was consistently critical of discrimination and exploitation, but she maintained careful standards of evidence and avoided making accusations that could create libel exposure. Johnson met with Margaret in the newspaper's office and provided a detailed account of the April 22nd incident, along with testimony from his 3 associates who had witnessed the exclusion. Margaret asked probing questions about the specifics: what exactly was said, how the white couples were treated differently, whether there was documentary evidence of the discriminatory policy. "I can write about this," Margaret said, "but I need to be careful about how I frame it. I can describe what you experienced. I can note the pattern of differential treatment. I can raise questions about why an establishment in Harlem would exclude Harlem residents. But I can't make direct accusations of formal discrimination policy without proof they won't be able to refute." "That's sufficient," Johnson replied. "The goal is to make the discrimination visible. Once it's visible and documented, it becomes harder for them to continue it and harder for the community to ignore it." Margaret's article appeared in the May 3rd edition of the Harlem Advocate under the headline, "Questions Raised About Access to Harlem's New Establishments." The article described Johnson's experience at the Lenox Lounge, quoted his account and his associates' observations, and noted that several other community members had reported similar experiences of being turned away while white customers were admitted freely. The article was carefully written to present facts and raise questions rather than make accusations, but the implication was clear to anyone reading it. The third key ally was a labor organizer named Samuel, who worked with the Hotel Employees and Restaurant Employees Union. Samuel was 38 years old, experienced in organizing workers across racial lines, and understood how labor solidarity could be leveraged to create economic pressure on employers. His involvement would be critical because the Lenox Lounge employed approximately 30 people: bartenders, waitstaff, kitchen workers, musicians, security personnel, and most of these employees were black residents of Harlem who needed their jobs, but who could potentially be organized to take collective action. Johnson's conversation with Samuel focused on the practical challenges of organizing the lounge's employees. Many would be reluctant to jeopardize their employment by participating in any action against their employer. They would need assurances that they would have alternative employment if they were fired. They would need to understand that the organizing was part of a broader community effort rather than simply a labor dispute. And they would need to see evidence that the pressure campaign had sufficient support to succeed, because participating in a failed effort would leave them unemployed with no tangible gain. Samuel agreed to begin quiet conversations with employees, assessing their willingness to participate in various forms of action, ranging from work slowdowns to complete walkouts. He would not push for immediate action, but would build relationships and trust, creating the foundation for coordinated response when the broader campaign reached the point where employee participation would be most effective. The fourth ally was a lawyer named David Ross, who had practiced in Harlem for 2 decades and who specialized in civil rights cases. Ross was 51 years old, Jewish, and had been involved in early civil rights litigation challenging discrimination in housing, employment, and public accommodations. His involvement would provide legal framework for the campaign and would create potential pathways for formal complaints if the informal pressure tactics proved insufficient. Ross analyzed the legal landscape carefully when Johnson met with him. New York State had passed anti-discrimination laws in 1945 that prohibited discrimination in places of public accommodation. But enforcement was weak, and complaints often went unresolved for years. The laws provided theoretical protection, but practical recourse was limited. What this means, Ross explained, is that the legal route will be slow and uncertain. We can file complaints with the State Commission Against Discrimination, but resolution might take years, and the penalties are minimal, even if we win. The law is useful primarily as support for other forms of pressure. It establishes that discrimination is illegal. It creates documentary record. It generates publicity. But it won't by itself force behavior change quickly enough to matter. So legal action is secondary to economic and social pressure, Johnson said. Exactly. Use the legal system to legitimize and document your claims, but don't depend on it to deliver results. With these allies in place, Johnson began coordinating the multi-front campaign that would target the Lenox Lounge. The strategy had several components that would be implemented simultaneously to create cumulative pressure. The first component was the boycott. Reverend Thomas preached a sermon on May 11th about economic justice and community solidarity, describing how businesses that discriminated against black customers should not receive black patronage. He did not mention the Lenox Lounge by name, but the timing and context made the reference clear to anyone who had read Margaret's article. Other ministers in Harlem, coordinating through informal networks, delivered similar messages over the following Sundays. The message spread through church networks and social organizations. Supporting businesses that discriminated was betraying the community. The boycott message was reinforced through distribution of flyers that provided specific information about the Lenox Lounge's discriminatory practices. The flyers were printed at a shop that Johnson controlled and were distributed by volunteers throughout Harlem, left in barber shops, beauty parlors, restaurants, and other gathering places where people would encounter them naturally. The flyers were factual rather than inflammatory, simply describing the April 22nd incident and other reported cases of discrimination, and asking readers to consider whether they wanted to support establishments that treated them as undesirable. The second component was employee organizing. Samuel began meeting with workers from the Lenox Lounge, initially in casual conversations outside their workplace and later in more structured discussions about their working conditions and their willingness to participate in collective action. He discovered significant dissatisfaction beyond the discrimination issue. Wages were below union standards. Working conditions included long hours without adequate breaks. Tips were being pooled in ways that benefited management more than workers, and several employees had been fired without cause in ways that suggested retaliation for complaints. This dissatisfaction provided leverage beyond the discrimination issue. Samuel worked with employees to document their complaints and to organize them around concrete demands for improved working conditions. By late May, approximately 20 of the 30 employees had signed union cards indicating their support for collective bargaining. This gave Samuel the ability to file for union recognition, which would require the employer to negotiate with employees or face potential strikes and legal challenges. The third component was supply chain disruption. The Lenox Lounge depended on various suppliers for food, alcohol, linens, and other necessities. Johnson used his connections throughout Harlem's business community to identify which suppliers the lounge used and to encourage those suppliers to reconsider their business relationships. This was done quietly, through private conversations that explained the community campaign against the lounge and that suggested suppliers might want to avoid being associated with an establishment that was increasingly controversial. Several suppliers responded by raising prices or by claiming supply shortages that made fulfilling orders difficult. This was not complete cutoff, which would have created obvious evidence of coordinated action that could generate legal problems, but rather subtle degradation of service that increased the lounge's operating costs and created constant minor difficulties. Food deliveries arrived late. Alcohol orders were short or substituted with different brands. Linen service became unreliable. Each individual problem was minor and could be explained as normal business friction, but cumulatively they made operations more difficult and more expensive. The fourth component was social pressure targeting white customers who continued patronizing the lounge. This was the most delicate aspect of the campaign because it risked alienating potential allies and because it could escalate into confrontations that would justify police intervention. The approach was nonviolent but visible. Groups of protesters would stand outside the lounge's entrance holding signs that informed customers about the discriminatory practices. The signs simply stated facts. This establishment discriminates against black customers, and the protesters did not block entry or harass patrons, but their presence created social discomfort that discouraged some white customers from entering. And the fifth component was media attention beyond the community newspaper. Margaret's initial article had documented the discrimination, but broader coverage would increase pressure by threatening the owners' reputations beyond Harlem. Johnson worked through intermediaries to bring the story to attention of mainstream newspapers and to activists who were beginning to organize what would become the broader civil rights movement. This resulted in coverage in the New York-Amsterdam News and in mentions by civil rights organizations that were documenting patterns of discrimination across the city. The sixth component was regulatory pressure. Ross filed a formal complaint with the State Commission Against Discrimination, providing detailed testimony about the April 22nd incident and about the pattern of discriminatory practices. And he also initiated complaints with city agencies about various code violations: fire code, health code, occupancy regulations. Many of these complaints were minor issues that normally would have been overlooked, but formal complaints required inspection and created documentation that could be used to threaten business licenses if violations were not corrected. These 6 components were implemented over May and June, creating layered pressure that affected the Lenox Lounge's operations from multiple directions simultaneously. The owner's initial response was to dismiss the campaign as temporary and to continue operating as though nothing had changed. They increased security at the entrance to prevent protesters from interfering with customers. They fought the union, organizing through standard anti-union tactics, like threatening employees and hiring consultants to disrupt organizing meetings. They addressed code violations selectively, fixing obvious problems while ignoring others. But by early July, the cumulative effect of the pressure was becoming financially significant. Revenue had declined approximately 40% compared to pre-campaign levels, as the boycott reduced black patronage and the protests discouraged some white customers. The employee organizing had resulted in union recognition vote scheduled for mid-July, which threatened to increase labor costs significantly. Supply chain disruptions had increased operating expenses by approximately 20%. Legal costs from fighting the various complaints and inspections were mounting, and the owners attempted to adapt by quietly changing their policies to allow black customers while maintaining the upscale atmosphere they had originally envisioned. They placed advertisements in the Harlem Advocate announcing that the lounge welcomed all customers regardless of race. They offered to meet with community leaders to discuss their commitment to serving Harlem residents. They proposed donations to local churches and community organizations as demonstration of good faith. These gestures were rejected as insufficient by the coalition Johnson had organized. The campaign's demands had evolved beyond simply ending discrimination at one establishment. The coalition now demanded that the owners sell the business to black ownership, and on the theory that true community control required ownership by people who lived in and were accountable to the community. This was more than challenging discriminatory practices. It was challenging the economic structure that allowed white businessmen to profit from black neighborhoods while maintaining the power to exclude black people from the benefits of their own community's commercial vitality. The owners resisted this demand, arguing that it amounted to forced sale of private property and that they had addressed the discrimination issue by changing their policies. But their negotiating position was weak. The business was losing money steadily. The pressure campaign showed no signs of diminishing. If anything, it was intensifying as more organizations joined and as the issue gained attention beyond Harlem. The union vote was likely to succeed, which would increase labor costs in ways that would make profitability even more difficult. And the owners faced reputational damage that extended to their other business interests outside Harlem. In August, the owners approached Johnson through intermediaries to negotiate settlement. The negotiations were conducted through Ross, who represented the community coalition in formal discussions about terms. The conversations occurred over 3 weeks and covered multiple potential arrangements before reaching agreement. The final settlement involved the owners selling the Lenox Lounge to a group of black investors that Johnson had organized. And the purchase price was significantly below the establishment's theoretical market value, but reflected its actual value given the ongoing campaign and declining revenue. The investor group included Johnson, but also included several legitimate business people from Harlem who would provide public face of ownership while Johnson maintained financial interest. The sale was structured as normal commercial transaction, avoiding any suggestion of coercion while accomplishing the campaign's goal of transferring control to community ownership. The transfer of ownership was completed in September 1947. The new owners maintained the establishment's name, but changed its operating philosophy to emphasize serving Harlem residents while remaining open to all customers. They retained most of the existing employees under union contract that Samuel had negotiated, improving wages and working conditions while maintaining the establishment's operational capacity. They hired a manager from within the community who had experience in entertainment venues and who understood Harlem's cultural landscape. The changes in operation were visible within weeks. The doorman who had turned away Johnson in April was replaced by someone who welcomed all customers with equal courtesy. The entertainment bookings shifted to feature more musicians from Harlem who had previously been limited to venues that paid poorly. The menu incorporated foods that reflected the community's tastes while maintaining quality standards. And the prices were adjusted to make the establishment accessible to working-class and middle-class residents rather than only to wealthy visitors from downtown. The transformation of the Lenox Lounge had implications that extended beyond that single establishment. The successful campaign demonstrated several important principles that other organizers and activists absorbed and applied to their own efforts. First, it demonstrated that economic pressure coordinated across multiple fronts could force change even when legal recourse was slow or ineffective. The boycott, employee organizing, supply chain disruption, and regulatory complaints individually might have been absorbed or resisted, but together they created unsustainable cost that made maintaining discriminatory practices economically irrational. Second, it demonstrated the importance of coalition building that brought together different community institutions and different types of power. Ministers provided moral authority and access to congregation networks. Labor organizers provided ability to coordinate employee action. Lawyers provided legal framework and formal complaints. Business owners provided economic leverage through supply relationships. Media provided publicity and documentation. No single component would have been sufficient, but together they created comprehensive pressure. Third, it demonstrated that effective organizing required escalating demands beyond immediate grievances to address underlying structural problems. The campaign began with challenging one establishment's discriminatory practices, but evolved to demanding community ownership as the only reliable guarantee against future exploitation. This escalation was strategic rather than idealistic. It recognized that changing individual behavior was insufficient if the economic structure that incentivized that behavior remained intact. Fourth, it demonstrated the importance of sustained pressure over time rather than dramatic confrontation. The campaign lasted 5 months, from the initial incident to final settlement. During those months, pressure was applied persistently, but without the kind of spectacular violence or disruption that would have justified police crackdown. The approach was patient, methodical, and cumulative, recognizing that changing economic calculations required time and that premature confrontation would likely fail. Through late 1947 and into 1948, similar campaigns were organized against other establishments in Harlem that practiced discrimination or that were owned by people who extracted wealth without serving community interests. Some campaigns succeeded quickly as owners recognized the pattern established by the Lenox Lounge case and decided that accommodation was preferable to extended conflict. Other campaigns faced more resistance and required sustained effort before achieving results. But the template existed, and the tactics were understood, making each subsequent effort more efficient than the previous one. The broader civil rights movement that accelerated through the 1950s and 1960s learned from these economic campaigns in Harlem and elsewhere. The Montgomery bus boycott in 1955, the sit-in movements of the early 1960s, the economic boycotts that accompanied school desegregation efforts, all employed similar principles of coordinated economic pressure, coalition building, sustained effort, and escalating demands beyond immediate grievances to address structural discrimination. Johnson's role in the Lenox Lounge campaign was substantial, but was deliberately kept semi-public. He was known within Harlem as one of the organizers, but newspaper coverage and public statements emphasized the ministers, lawyers, and legitimate community leaders who fronted the coalition. This was strategic. Johnson's background in illegal enterprises would have complicated the campaign's moral claims and would have provided opponents with ammunition to dismiss the effort as criminal interference rather than legitimate community organizing. But within Harlem's power structure, Johnson's capability for organizing complex multi-front campaigns became widely recognized and respected. He had demonstrated that he understood not just street-level operations, but also economic leverage, coalition building, legal frameworks, and strategic communications. This recognition brought him increased influence in community decisions and increased legitimacy as someone who could speak for Harlem's interests in negotiations with outside powers. When Johnson died in 1968, the Lenox Lounge was still operating under community ownership and was recognized as one of Harlem's important cultural institutions. The establishment had hosted performances by major jazz artists, had survived economic downturns that closed other venues, and had remained committed to serving the community it was located in, rather than treating it as colonial territory to be exploited. The lounge operated in various forms until 2012, when it finally closed due to rent increases and changing neighborhood demographics. But its 65-year history stood as testament to what community-controlled institutions could accomplish. Reverend Thomas, who had provided crucial moral authority and organizational support for the campaign, continued his ministry until his death in 1965. His sermons about economic justice and community solidarity influenced a generation of Harlem residents and provided theological justification for the economic organizing that characterized the neighborhood's response to discrimination and exploitation. His funeral was attended by thousands, and speakers described him as someone who understood that faith required action and that moral authority must be exercised in service of justice. Margaret, who had documented the discrimination and kept public attention focused on the campaign, continued publishing the Harlem Advocate until 1959. When financial pressures forced the paper to close. Her journalism had provided critical support for numerous community organizing efforts beyond the Lenox Lounge campaign, and her documentation of discriminatory practices created historical record that was used by later scholars studying the civil rights era. She died in 1973, largely forgotten outside Harlem, but remembered within the community as someone who had used her skills to serve collective interests rather than personal advancement. Samuel, the labor organizer who had coordinated employee action, continued organizing workers throughout Harlem and eventually became a regional director for his union. He applied the lessons learned in the Lenox Lounge campaign to organizing efforts across New York, always emphasizing that worker solidarity must be connected to broader community struggles and that economic justice required challenging ownership structures rather than simply negotiating better terms within existing arrangements. He died in 1981. Having participated in hundreds of organizing campaigns and having trained younger organizers who carried his methods forward. David Ross, the lawyer who had provided legal framework and formal complaints, continued his civil rights practice until his retirement in 1975. He represented clients in numerous cases challenging discrimination, handled criminal defense for civil rights protesters, and taught younger lawyers about using legal tools in service of social justice. His work contributed to the legal precedents that eventually made discrimination more difficult to practice openly and created enforcement mechanisms stronger than those available in 1947. The doorman who had turned Johnson away on April 22, 1947, was never identified publicly, and his subsequent trajectory was unknown. He was simply a person doing the job he had been hired to do, enforcing policies created by owners who did not live in the community and who viewed discrimination as normal business practice. His individual actions were symptoms of structural problems rather than causes, and addressing those structural problems required more than punishing individuals who implemented discriminatory policies. The story of the Lenox Lounge campaign entered Harlem's oral history as an example of how organized community power could challenge discrimination and exploitation successfully. The details were sometimes compressed or altered in the retelling. Some versions emphasized dramatic confrontations that never occurred. Others attributed the victory to individual heroism rather than collective organization. But the essential lesson remained that change required intelligence, patience, coalition building, and sustained pressure rather than spectacular gestures or emotional reactions. Johnson himself rarely discussed the campaign in later years. When asked about it, he would typically redirect conversation to the broader community effort and to the work of ministers, labor organizers, journalists, and lawyers who had made success possible. This redirection was partly tactical. Maintaining some distance from high-profile campaigns protected him from increased law enforcement attention, but it was also sincere recognition that systemic change required collective action rather than individual leadership. The April 22nd evening when Johnson approached the Lenox Lounge entrance and was turned away marked the 0 point of a transformation that extended far beyond personal vindication. The insult he experienced was ordinary by the standards of racial discrimination in 1940s America. Similar insults occurred thousands of times daily across the country as black people were excluded from restaurants, hotels, theaters, and countless other spaces that white Americans accessed without thought. But this particular insult triggered a response that changed one establishment's ownership and operating philosophy, that demonstrated effective tactics for challenging discrimination through economic pressure, that created a template for future organizing that contributed to the broader momentum toward civil rights. And that showed a community that systemic problems required systematic responses rather than individual reactions. The legacy was not triumph, but possibility. The campaign did not end discrimination. Harlem continued experiencing exploitation and extraction from outside business interests for decades afterward. But it demonstrated that resistance was possible, that organization could substitute for superior economic resources, that patience and intelligence could defeat assumed superiority, and that communities could control their own economic institutions if they coordinated effectively. The story ended not with celebration, but with understanding. Power had shifted, not because of dramatic confrontation, but because of methodical application of economic pressure across multiple fronts simultaneously. Justice had advanced not because of moral appeals, but because discrimination had been made unprofitable. The system had changed not because people in power had experienced moral transformation, but because organized collective action had altered the economic calculations that determined their behavior. These lessons outlasted the specific campaign and the specific individuals involved. They became part of the accumulated knowledge that communities used to resist exploitation, that organizers used to challenge unjust systems, that movements used to pursue social change. And they remained relevant decades later, whenever people faced exclusion or exploitation and needed to understand how patient strategic organization could transform humiliation into leverage, insult into power, and zero position into foundation for systematic change.